Throughout time, people across the world told each other tales of how they came to be, of heroes and monsters, romance and tragedy, death and rebirth. Mythology helped shape the ancient world, explaining the unexplainable. This is Mythology Unleashed. In days of yore and times long gone, there lived in a town of Persia two brothers, Casim and Ali Baba. Their father left for them a small inheritance divided equally between them, one that evaporated within no time at all. Casim eventually married a rich widow and became a wealthy merchant, while Ali Baba married a woman as poor as himself, and he made a living by cutting wood and gathering tinder and selling it in town. One day, when Ali Baba was in the forest and had just cut wood enough to load his mules, he saw in the distance a great cloud of dust approaching with great speed. He soon realized that it was a body of horsemen, hardened and fierce-looking, more than likely to be bandits. Ali Baba hid his mules in the brush, and he climbed up a large tree planted on a high rock, the branches thick enough to conceal him, and yet enabled him to see all that passed without being discovered. The troop came to the foot of the rock on which the tree stood, 40 strong, well-mounted and well-armed. One of them, their captain, faced the great boulder and stated clearly, "Open Sesame." As if by magic, a door opened in the rock, and after the entire troop entered the cave, the door shut once more. The thieves stayed some time within the cave, during which Ali Baba, fearful of being caught, remained in the tree. At last the door opened once more, and the captain emerged with his troop behind him, and when all had exited, the captain commanded the door closed by pronouncing the words, "Shut Sesame." The 40 thieves all remounted their horses and returned the way they had come. When Ali Baba was sure that they were gone, he descended from his hiding spot and recited the magic words, whereupon the door instantly flew wide open. Now Ali Baba expected a dark, dismal cavern, but was surprised to see a well-lit and spacious chamber, lighted from an opening at the top of the rock, and filled with all sorts of provisions, rich bales of silk, embroideries, and valuable carpets piled up on one another, gold and silver ingots in great heaps, and money within bags. The sight of all these riches made him suppose that this cave must have been occupied for ages by thieves who had succeeded one another. Truly, a cave of wonders. Ali Baba went boldly into the cave and collected as much of the gold coin-filled bags as his 3 mules could carry. When he had loaded them with the bags, he laid wood over them so that they could not be seen. Then he stood before the door and recited the words, "Shut Sesame," and the door closed itself, and he made the best of his way to the town. When he got home, he stealthily carried the bags into his house and showed his wife his great discovery. When he had emptied the bags, his wife's eyes dazzled, and then he told her the whole adventure from beginning to end, and above all, urged her to keep it secret. His wife rejoiced greatly at their newfound fortune, and would count all the gold piece by piece. Ali Baba, on the other hand, opted to dig a hole and bury it for a rainy day. His wife ultimately agreed. However, her curiosity as to the treasure's amount drove her to convince Ali Baba to let them weigh their newfound wealth. So his wife ran to her brother-in-law, Casim, and asked her sister-in-law to lend her a balancing scale for a little while. The sister-in-law did so, but as she knew Ali Baba's poverty, she was curious to know what sort of grain his wife wanted to measure, and slyly put some suet at the bottom of the measure. After the gold had been weighed and measured, and while Ali Baba was burying the gold, his wife carried the measure back again to her sister-in-law, but failed to notice a piece of gold had stuck to the bottom. As soon as she was gone, Casim's wife discovered the gold coin sticking to the measure. Envy immediately possessed her, and she informed her husband of the matter. Now Casim, after he had married the rich widow, had never treated Ali Baba as a brother, but neglected him, and now instead of being pleased, he conceived a base envy at his brother's prosperity. He could not sleep all that night, and went to him in the morning before sunrise, demanding explanation for the newfound wealth. Ali Baba explained the situation to his jealous brother, and offered his brother his part of his treasure to keep the secret. But Casim rose the next morning before sunrise, and set out for the forest with 10 mules bearing great chests. When he reached the entrance of the cave, he shouted the magic words, "Open, Sesame." The door immediately opened, and he was in, and it closed upon him. Casim was overwhelmed by the vast loot before him. He quickly laid as many bags of gold as he could carry at the door of the cavern, but his thoughts were so full of the great riches he should possess that he could not remember the word to make it open again. Instead of sesame, he shouted, "Open barley," and several other sorts of grain. But the door remained shut. At noontime, the 40 thieves visited their cave, and saw Casim's mules straggling about the rock, with great chests on their backs. Alarmed at this, they galloped full speed to the cave. They approached the door, swords drawn, and their captain recited the proper words, "Open, Sesame," immediately opening the door. Casim, who heard the noise of the horses' hooves, at once guessed the arrival of the thieves, and rushed to the door, intent on battling the 40 thieves, who with their scimitars soon deprived him of life. The thieves found all the bags which Casim had gathered, but they did not miss what Ali Baba had taken away before. Confused and concerned how the intruder had learned the secret words, by which alone he could enter, they cut Casim's body into 4 quarters, and hung 2 on either side of the cave's entrance. In the meantime, Casim's wife was very uneasy. When night came, and her husband had not returned, she ran to Ali Baba in great alarm, afraid some misfortune had happened to Casim. In the midnight hour, Ali Baba made his way to the cave, still red with his brother's blood. When he had pronounced the magic words, and the door had opened, he was struck with horror at the dismal sight of his brother's dismembered body. Taking his brother's remains, and a few bags of gold, he returned home, giving his wife the newfound gold, while he set about tending to his brother's pieces. Intent on keeping Casim's murder a secret from the widow and the general populace, he enlisted the aid of Morgiana, a clever slave girl who was fruitful in inventions to meet the most difficult circumstances. The two plotted to bury Casim as if he had died a natural death, so Morgiana went out early the next morning to an apothecary and asked for a sort of lozenge which was considered effective in the most dangerous disorders, claiming her master Casim to be violently ill. That evening, Morgiana and Casim's wife cried and lamented that Casim was dead. And the next morning at daybreak, Morgiana went to an old cobbler called Baba Mustafa and bade him to stitch the pieces of Casim back together and keep secret, convincing him with gold and blindfolding him to and from the dwelling, so he may not know exactly who he was cobbling and where they may be found. With Casim pieced back together and the story set, Ali Baba and his family were able to properly bury their dear yet foolish Casim. Several days after the funeral, Ali Baba removed his few goods openly to his sister-in-law's house, in which he would in future live. But the money he had taken from the thieves he conveyed there by night, while Casim's shop was entrusted entirely to the management of his eldest son. Meanwhile, the 40 thieves again visited their cave, and great was their surprise to find that Casim's body was taken away, along with some of their bags of gold. They were certainly discovered. The removal of the body and the loss of some of the loot plainly showed that the man that was killed had an accomplice, and they must find him and deal with him, lest they be executed. The captain sent the boldest and most skillful among the troop to go into the town, disguised as a traveler and a stranger, to decipher any information of the man that they killed, namely, where he lived. The selected thief came to Baba Mustafa's stall, and managed to swindle information from the old cobbler, with a combination of craftiness and pilfered gold, and he even succeeded in learning of the location of the killed man's home, marking it with chalk. After the thief and Baba Mustafa had parted, Morgiana found the mark the thief had made, and deduced that somebody intended Ali Baba no good. Accordingly, she fetched a piece of chalk and marked several neighborhood doors on each side in the same manner, without saying a word to her master or mistress. In the meantime, the thief rejoined the others in the forest, and recounted to them his success. But when the thieves returned that night, they could not decipher which house was the correct one, as it seemed the entire neighborhood had their doors marked with chalk. Angrily, the captain killed the thief, and he sent another to obtain information from the cobbler. Just as before, the new thief managed to secure the desired information, and marked Ali Baba's house by chipping a piece of stone from the front door. And just as before, Morgiana proceeded to do the same to every house on the block, once again confounding the 40 thieves, and leading to the death of the thief responsible. The captain, having lost 2 brave fellows of his troop, resolved to take upon the matter himself. Accordingly, he addressed himself to Baba Mustafa, who did him the same service he had done to the other robbers, and did not set any particular mark on the house, but rather examined and observed it so carefully that it was impossible for him to mistake it. Well satisfied in his effort, the captain concocted a plan to rid themselves of Ali Baba. The captain disguised himself as an oil merchant and led a procession of 19 mules into town, all carrying large jars, one filled with mustard oil, and the rest housing each of the remaining thieves. He led them through the streets until he came to Ali Baba's door, where he was sitting after dinner. He stopped his mules, addressed himself to him, and asked Ali Baba for lodgings for the night. Though Ali Baba had seen the captain of the thieves in the forest, and had heard him speak, it was impossible to know him in the disguise of an oil merchant, and he welcomed him inside. After dinner was held and the household began to retire, the captain of the thieves went into the yard, took off the lid of each jar, and gave his men orders what to do. Later that night, as Morgiana went to fetch oil for her lamp, she heard the soft voices of the thieves talking to one another, emanating from the jars. By this means, Morgiana discovered that her master Ali Baba had admitted 38 thieves into his house, and that his pretended oil merchant was their captain. She quickly filled her oil pot with boiling oil, and went and poured enough into every jar to stifle and kill the thief within. After Morgiana had slain them all and covered her tracks, the thieves' captain arose, opened the window, and gave his troops the signal to attack. He listened, but not hearing or perceiving anything, he began to grow uneasy. he went softly down into the yard, and he discovered the entirety of his men were killed. Panicking, the captain climbed over the walls, and he made his escape. When Morgiana saw him depart, she went to bed, satisfied and pleased to have succeeded so well in saving her master and her family. The next morning, Morgiana explained to Ali Baba the events of the previous night, of the once 40 thieves who intended to kill him and the family, her slaughtering of them, and the flight of their captain. On hearing of these brave deeds from the lips of Morgiana, Ali Baba thanked her profusely, and the two proceeded to bury the bodies of the thieves in the gardens, hid the jars and the weapons, and sold the mules at market. Meanwhile, the captain returned to the forest with inconceivable mortification. Determined to avenge the fate of his companions, he returned to the town and established himself as a silk merchant. Under this assumed character, he gradually conveyed a great many sorts of fine linen to his lodging from the cavern, with all necessary precaution to conceal the place whence he brought them. In order to dispose of the merchandise, he took a warehouse, which so happened to be opposite of Casim's, which Ali Baba's son had occupied since the death of his uncle. In no time, the former thief captain and Ali Baba's son became good friends, and so the criminal wormed his way into Ali Baba's circle. The night had come when Ali Baba was to host his son and the new silk merchant in his home, the latter of whom asking that his meats not be cooked with salt or spices. Now Morgiana, who was always ready to obey her master and the whims of the guests, could not help being surprised at this order. Who is this strange man who eats no salt with his meat? When she saw who had made the request, she knew him at first sight, notwithstanding his disguise, to be the captain of the thieves, and quickly perceived that he had a dagger under his garment, ready to kill. When dinner was served, Morgiana dressed herself in dancing attire, with a silver-gilt girdle about her waist, and a beautiful veil on her face. After she had danced several dances with much grace, she drew a dagger, and holding it in her hand, began a dance, in which she outdid herself by the many different figures, light movements, and the surprising leaps and wonderful exertions with which she accompanied it. When the audience was truly transfixed upon the beautiful dancer, Morgiana suddenly turned and plunged the dagger deep into the heart of the disguised captain. Ali Baba and his son were shocked at this action, but a quick explanation from Morgiana and an examination of the corpse revealed the silk merchant's true identity. Then Ali Baba, seeing that Morgiana had saved his life a second time, embraced her, granted her liberation, and made her his daughter-in-law. 1 year after the wedding of Morgiana and his son, Ali Baba journeyed to the thieves' cave for the first time since his brother's passing. Then, approaching the entrance, pronounced the words, "Open Sesame," whereupon the door opened. He entered the cavern and saw that it had been long abandoned. Ali Baba was the only person in the entire world who held the secret of opening the cave, and all of the treasure within was at his sole disposal. Some years later, he brought his son and Morgiana to the cave and taught them the secret, which they handed down to his posterity, who, using their good fortune with moderation, lived in great honor and splendor until the day they died.